Welcome to the first part of our new curriculum, EEG Electroencephalography, with a German subtitle. It's called Gedankenströme, which translates into something like stream of thoughts. I'm speaking English because we invited some non-European scientists and clinicians, and hopefully they will join us. And however, I welcome all of you to the first part today of this curriculum, which has been designed by Tobias Welt, Stefano Ferreira, and also me. And we try to cover the most important aspects of EEG, a technique that just celebrated its 100th birthday last year. And we think that the reason why to perform an EEG on your patients, or maybe for scientific purposes, is still there, and that nowadays EEG might even become more helpful with the new occurring techniques. However, that all of you might learn the basics of EEG from the clinical perspective, but as well as from the scientific perspective. We designed this curriculum. We now have 8 parts, and maybe we'll continue later with that. We try to keep it very basic so that all of you can just join and will be able to follow what we are saying. And we also include a case at the end of every session, which only lasts like 30 minutes. So if you have any questions in between, you can either write it in the chat, or maybe we can try that you just interrupt me or interrupt us and ask a question. If this works out, we will continue like this. Otherwise, we will have to think of something else. But however, for today, if you have a question, just raise your hand, ask the chat within the chat, or just raise your voice. Okay. Can you see the screens? Yes. So maybe Tobias, you decide this second aspect besides the case report of our curriculum. Maybe you want to tell something about that?
Yes. So we decided to just like to deepen your learning experience about the EEG. We try to also add a little practice quiz. So each session will have a little quiz. You don't need a clicker account to take the quiz. You use the barcode, so you can create a clicker account, and you use the PIN code of this course. You will have a clicker account for this course, and you will get points for your answers. So in at the end of the course, we will have a winner. If and we will decide.
Okay. Am I having problems with my connection, or is Tobias?
What the winner will get? Haven't found that, but part. If you have knowledge, there are 7 simple questions.
Tobias, your connection is very bad. Tobias, we only can hardly hear you. Your connection is very bad. So maybe I just put together what he said. So you can just scan this code that Tobias generated, and then you will have 7 simple questions that you can follow. You don't need to sign up for this quiz. You can just do it. However, if you decide to create an account, you will have some kind of verification. Tobias, your connection is very bad. I just repeated that. Can you hear me?
Yes, and I will put the information also into the chat. So I will just copy this information into the chat, so no stress at the moment.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tobias. So let's continue and jump right into the game. So what are the topics for today? The first objective is what is EEG and what is its relevance today? We want to understand the basic principles of EEG. So we will dive a little bit into anatomy and maybe even into biochemistry. Tobias, good. And in the end, we will explore the electrophysiological underpinnings of brain activity and have a case report. Okay, so what is an EEG believer? So nowadays in psychiatry, the people are divided into believers and so-called non-believers. That means people who perform an EEG in psychiatry and people who don't. Oliver Pogerel, one of my mentors in working in the University of Munich, he is a strong believer, and he put together these two slides. And the first slide is about the non-believers. They said that EEG in psychiatry doesn't add to the knowledge we have about our patients. We do a lot of EEGs, but it does have no influence on the treatment of the patients. However, there are the believers. And the believers say, well, EEG is highly available and you need to perform it because you gain a lot of information about your patients. You gain a lot of knowledge of what you can do better with the patients by means of epilepsy, by means of medication, and so on. I don't know to which side you belong. However, hopefully after these 8 sessions, you will belong to the believers and will try to use the EEG for good purposes in the clinical practice. Maybe you will also like to have it in your research. So let's jump a little bit into the history. So what were the beginnings? That's a very, very brief history. So in the beginning, there were these Galvani's animal electricity. So the people realized in the 18th century, first Luigi Galvani, that there is some kind of electric activity, and even more, that activity of the muscles can be triggered by inducing electricity. And this was done by the example of the frog. So if you applied some electric currents to the frog muscles, then the muscles moved. And this was the first proof that the nervous system of animals and maybe also of humans works with electricity. So there were many, many steps in between, but in the end, it led up to the EEG, as you will see. And let me just add one more very interesting fact or fun fact about electricity and the brain, because here we have, in German, we have a word that's called Anspannung, or in English, it's tension. And the word Anspannung is a psychological, psychopathological term that we use for patients with high tension. However, the term Anspannung, which is tightly linked to electricity, only was induced after the electrification of the world. That means after people invented how they use the current for having lights, for having generators and amplifiers and so on. This word was used to describe the humans. So electrification was not only for the machines, but also had influence on the way we think about our patients. Nowadays, Anspannung is a very a term that is used very often. So it's like a feedback loop, the electrification, the human brain, and psychiatry. So let's get back to the EEG. So there was this infamous Hans Berger. I will tell you why he was infamous. And here you see on the left side a picture about the first devices he used. And they were bigger than today, but essentially they worked the same. So it was a differential amplifiers that amplify the signal that can be recorded on the surface of your brain, and that that fetches the activity of the neurons in your brain and the activity of the 100 or even more 100,000 neurons that act collectively. And you also see like a few pictures of Hans Berger painted by some artists. And what's maybe also important, and just to mention it, because in psychiatry many people do bad things or have done bad things and got away with that. However, Hans Berger also was a Nazi. He supported the SS in the German Reich, and he was convinced to advocate racial hygiene, and he contributed some works and writings to forced sterilization, and he was an expert opinionist for hereditary health codes. He died by suicide in the end in 1941, maybe also due to his inflictions with the Nazi regime. However, on the side of the science, he not discovered the EEG, but was the first who recorded an EEG, and mainly in his son. So and here you see the first traces of the EEG on the top. So this top trace here is the EEG recorded in the sun, and on the bottom you see a metronome. That means it was acting like 10 times a second. It performed a wave, a sinus wave, and you see that the brain rhythm of the sun almost mimics this 10 hertz of the metronome, and this is what we call the ground rhythm of the brain, the alpha rhythm. And this is maybe the first thing that you can learn today. The alpha rhythm of the brain is something that your heartbeat. So this is the brain rhythm, the basic brain rhythm that you have when you close your eyes, and most of you will have that, and it mainly occurs over occipital sides, but also moves to more anterior sides. However, this brain rhythm is very important, and very interestingly, already Hans Berger said that this alpha rhythm might be tightly linked to depression. That means, he said, the more you have this idling rhythm of the brain, the more widespread it is and the more rigid it is, and the more depressed the patient seems to be. However, and this is maybe the second thing you can take away from today, you never make a diagnosis only based on EEG. That means only that you have a lot of alpha rhythm does not mean that you have depression. However, if you have depression, you tend to have more alpha rhythm. So that means you only judge the EEG when including other information about the patient, about circumstances, about medication, and so on. So the EEG never is a standalone fact, but also always has to be regarded in combination with other facts. So let's continue in the story of the EEG, and here we have the pharmaco-EEG, which was introduced as long ago as the 1950s, where Max Fink, one of the old EEGists, reported close correlations between improvements after electroconvulsive therapy and EEG changes. So it was clear that if your psychopathological state changes, the EEG also changes. And then in 1954, Ittel and Benton reported changes under chlorpromazine. So these were the neuroleptics of these days, and they reported that there are changes that are related to the effects of the drugs in the brain. And it continued that they showed, and now again, remember the alpha activity, the ground rhythm of the brain, it was reported that antidepressant medication caused a reduction in the EEG alpha activity. So remember, we said more alpha activity is more depression, and antidepressant medication reduced this alpha activity. So there seems to be a nice correlation between alpha rhythm and depression and medication. And even more important, and maybe this was the highlight of the so-called pharmaco-EEG, based on these findings, a new medication was discovered only using EEG. So they thought, okay, if you have a lot of alpha and you have a drug that reduces alpha, it might be an antidepressant. And they screened the EEGs of subjects that received different drugs, and they identified the nianserin, which is close to the nowadays miltazapine antidepressant that is still used. And this drug was discovered because they used the so-called key lock principle. They compared the brain maps before medication, after medication, and compared it with depressed patients and found, well, this should have an antidepressant profile. So using EEG led to the discovery of drugs. However, this was nothing that could be repeated since then. And so nowadays people try to find out new possibilities how to use the EEG. Before we come to that, how we use the EEG, let's now dive just very shortly and very quickly into the neuroanatomical underpinnings of EEG. And here, I'm sorry, it's German, I tried to provide in English. Here you see a pyramidal cell, which is in the cortex. You see the dendrites, and you see the soma and the axon of these neurons. And here you see an axon of another cell, and you see that some current is getting to the dendrites of this cell. And what happens? Is this something that we can measure with the EEG? No, of course, it's not, because we need a lot of incoming axons, currents from other axons and other neurons, and only if they get there at the same time, it introduces a so-called action potential. However, what we measure is not the action potential of the EEG, but what we measure is the so-called excitatory postsynaptic potential. And this is what the axons, the blue axons, do, and only if they do it in a huge number, we can measure the EEG. So You can remember pyramidal cells are the basics of our EEG, and they are located in the surface cortical areas. So if we go a little closer and go to the receptors and to the ions, you see that this blue thing here is the axon, and here you see the dendrites, and here you see the receptor channels, and you see what happens if the glutamate is transmitted into the synaptical cleft. You see that the kalium goes out, the natrium goes in, and there's a change of the polarization of the dendrites, and this is what we call the action potential. You see plus gets inside and the minus gets outside, and this change of polarization is what we can measure, and you can see it here again. So normally outside it's a positive charge, inside it's a negative charge, and if you now have this change, what happens is you have a difference between where you have the action potential and where you don't have the action potential, and this is the electrical field. So between positive and negative charges in the dendrites, you can find these differences of charges, and only if you have this multiple 100,000 times at the same place on the cortex, you can measure something that is called EEG. So let's go back to anatomy, and then I promise we will leave these things. So, oh wait, so where we go now is we go to the cortical surface. This is a video that has been done very long ago, so excuse the bad quality. So what we now see is that we have the scalp, and we have an electrode that you put on the scalp, and I ask you, do I measure something? No, I measure nothing. It's 0 volt. Then we have the gray matter and the bone, and what we do now is we have one axon, and everything is a little bit disrupted here, but I hope you can see it. So you have one neuron here, and we have an action potential here and there, and what we see is we have these electrical fields, and I asked you, do we measure something here? Can we see an EEG? No, we cannot. We cannot because the direction of the neurons is different, and they cancel out each other. So we won't be able to measure an EEG when we only use these non-aligned neurons. And now, if we put them all in one line, and if we now measure an action potential, and they all do it at the same time, and I asked you, can we measure something? Yes, we can measure something, but only if we have, and this is very important, one electrode here and one electrode here, because, and this is the third message that you maybe need to know for today, the EEG only measures a differential potential. That means the EEG curves that you see, they always show a difference between 2 points or several points in another point. So you don't have an absolute value of the EEG. It's always a comparison between 2 points and how it is distributed there. So this is something to remember, and this is also where we get to one of our next sessions, the so-called montages, where you link different electrodes against each other. So before we get to our case report for today's session, let's go into the topic when to use the EEG in psychiatry nowadays. And after having a clue of what is going on in the brain, this list shows you what it might be helpful from the clinical perspective. So let's go through it. So there's a baseline EEG before starting medication with lithium and clozapine. This is due to the bad effects it could have on the CNS. That means you could have epileptic seizures following clozapine. You can have a delirant states after having too much lithium. So this is why you take an EEG beforehand to see how the system looks before you put some medication into it. You needed to differential diagnosis, for example, to differentiate panic attacks versus real seizures or dissociative disorders. You can use it for differential diagnosis for depression with some cognitive deficits versus a real dementia where you could see some slowings. You always do it when you have a clinical presentation of seizures, for example, following alcohol withdrawal in psychiatry. We have the status epilepticus, for example, after ECT. We want to know if the epileptic activity stopped, and this is where you can use the EEG. We need it for exclusion of organic causes of symptoms, for example, in the first manifestation of psychosis. So we want to see if we have some activity that is not explained by normal CNS activity in the brain. We use it for delirious states, and we always use it for the exclusion of organic causes in cases of atypical presentation. That means if someone comes with the first time or first episode of, let's say, schizophrenia being in his 60s, then there might be something else, an organic cause behind it, not real schizophrenia. And so we do an EEG, of course, because this is an atypical presentation. So, and in the end, you see this is the last point, as part of the personalized medicine, EEG biomarkers might be helpful to identify best treatment regimes. This is a little bit of the music of the future, but we will also include it in our curriculum in the end, and you will get to know how we use it here in our clinic and how we can help our decisions for the best treatment of the patients. So this was it with the theoretical part, and we'll use the last 10 minutes for a case. So you now have, oh, let me see, I have to share again. Do you have any questions so far, or should we continue? No questions? Okay, so let me open up a case. So the case is 18-year-old.
Question, Sebastian.
Yep, question. Okay.
Just two short questions. As you have suggested EEG before starting medication with the lithium and clozapine. What do you mean? Should we perform an EEG also before starting bupropion? Also, it's a contraindication. Also, epileptic seizures are a contraindication for treatment, but so far I know it's not compulsory to write an EEG to derive an EEG before starting the medication.
I think it's not necessary that you do it. I would suggest, I mean, if you have someone here on the wards and we have the EEG, you want to first introduce bupropion, and it's mainly patients that have other drugs. I would suggest that you do an EEG just to be sure, but you don't have to. If you have any history of epileptic seizures before starting bupropion, of course you have to do an EEG. That's a very, very good question. Thanks for that. And we will get to the indications of where to use the EEG in medication in one of the following sessions. But also for bupropion, it might be good to follow this. And maybe also good to know, if you have a patient with a history of epileptic seizures and want to start antidepressant medication, you should start with sertraline if you have a possibility, because this seems to be the antidepressant drug that is maybe even a little bit protective for epileptic seizures. So there are first signs in the literature that's pointing toward that, and don't use bupropion in these cases. So,
okay, thank you. And you have mentioned a differential diagnosis between depression and dementia. Would you suggest also to use EEG for a differential diagnosis between depression and HED? Yes, because of the hyperactivity or arousal and hyperarousal, or
I mean, we will get to that when we talk about sleep and vigilance. I think there are some signs that could be helpful to differentiate between that. The evidence is not there yet that you could use it in the standardized procedure. But if you don't know, if you have a patient that might have ADHD or maybe something else, then it's worth to look at the EEG and collect this information, and maybe if you get another picture using this information. It's not, I think you don't need it as the only information source, but it could be helpful. Yes.
Thank you.
So here I just show you today, and I will introduce you. And maybe if you don't get to know too much today, and you're not used to look at EEGs, I will introduce you in the first slide, and then show you this and that in this case. So it was a very young person with the first psychotic episode, and it was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and medication with olanzapine was introduced. And of course, because the hallucinations continued, this female patient was to be subject to a clozapine treatment. And before starting that, they decided to do, of course, an EEG, as I told you. And what they saw is the following, and I will show you and maybe some of them know you. So to the left side of the EEG, I hope you can see my screen now. You always see these numbers and letters, which describe the channels, like in the ECG. And it's very easy in EEG because the odd numbers, like T3, the 3 is on the left side, and the normal numbers, or the non-odd numbers, the straight numbers, they are on the right side. F is frontal, O is occipital, T is temporal, and C is central, and P is parietal. So you know, just if you know the anatomy and remember your courses during your studies, you will just be able to read where this electrode is located. And as I told you, the EEG always records a differential potential. That means FP2, frontal parietal, frontal pole 2 versus the average. So this electrode is calculated against the average of all other electrodes, which is a common so-called montage. The second thing you need to know is the voltage, and you see here 50 microvolt. I always do it with the 50 microvolt. I'm used to that. You can decide to do something else. You can see I can increase the amplitude and I can decrease the amplitude. And what you then see is a screen of 10 seconds. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No, 8 seconds, sorry. And what you see here is the basic rhythm. So what I told you, this is so-called alpha rhythm. And it's mainly located in occipital sites, not in that patient. However, we will just count it. So this is 1 second, as you said. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so 8. So everything above 8 hertz is a good normal alpha rhythm. And this young female patient seems to have an alpha rhythm about 8 hertz with an amplitude of about 50 hertz. So what you see then is the so-called algorithm, and you don't need to remember everything. We will repeat this at every session. And if you now scroll through the EEG recording of following 8 seconds, you see here eyes closed. So the subject closes the eyes, and normally you see here alpha rhythm occurring. And before, with the open eyes, you should not have alpha rhythm. So this patient has alpha rhythm with eyes closed and eyes open, which is a sign that the patient might be quite tired. And we continue just to scroll through that. And what we are looking for before doing clozapine is we're looking for so-called ETPs, epilepsy typical potentials, and we'll try to find them. And due to the lack of time for today, I will just switch to that and go to some parts where we can see something that is suspicious. Let's say here and there, but what we see is not a real ETP, but what we see is here a highly irregular activity, which is some called a paroxysmal activity. However, just for you to compare it, we go here and you see a basic rhythm which is quite regular, and you see nothing is very out of the row, and here you see that the rhythm changes, and here you see, I'm gonna mark it for you, you see some activity that is not normal. You have higher amplitudes, you have an irregular activity, and this is something that is suspicious. However, let's continue, and we will go closer to what this could be, and we screen through the EEG, and we see that it continues like that. And I will switch to the next EEG of this patient after receiving the clozapine. So we had this activity with the slowing before, as I showed you, and I marked it in yellow, and this is due to the medication the patient received with olanzapine, but there were no ETPs. But when we then started with clozapine, we saw some signs, as you can see over here, and I mark it again with green, and you see that here you now have the so-called ETPs, and I make it smaller, the amplitude, so you see a typical going up, this is a negative inflection, and then down is a positive inflection, then a slow wave following after. So this is a classical ETP, and you see it if you go down with the amplitude, that it's mainly here you see frontally, and the second part is here also frontal to the left side. So this is where this is mainly taking place. So we have ETPs which are typical for clozapine, and when you now say, okay, now you have ETPs, do I have to start the clozapine? We again look in the file of the patient, and we see that she didn't have any seizures. However, we now know that she's prone to a highly excitated brain, and that we need to be careful when increasing the dosage and need to be careful when discovering that she had an anaphylactic seizure, because then we need to do something against it. However, now we just need to screen her for every 3 months because she had no seizures, but we need to have an eye on her. And if you go to the EEG, you see other potentials, as you can see here. And maybe we go a little bit further. And let's see, maybe we find something else. And you see something here. Again, a small spike and then a slow deflection following, which is typical for this EDP and the spike wave complex. We go a little bit to the end because I discovered, just in preparation of this, I discovered something that I hope we can see it. Yes. So here you see something that might be similar to a so-called ETP, but which is not, because the patient slept. Now, this is what we call a vertex wave. So it's called vertex wave because it's over the vertex, over CZ. This is a high positive deflection and high negative deflection over the vertex. And this is a sign of drowsiness. However, how to differentiate all these different potentials, we will learn during the following curriculars. Thanks for joining for today. You now have the possibility of asking questions, and otherwise you can of course write me, Stefano or Tobias, and also ask it now. And otherwise we are happy to see you during the next week. So are there any questions from your side? No questions? So really, we want to make it very interactive, and this maybe from the next time you can just try to ask questions, which will give a more interactive feeling. But however, for the first time, I think it's good. And if you have any suggestions on what we should include, we distributed the content of the curriculum. But if you have any other suggestions, please write us. We will try to include it in the following curricula. So long, see you during the next week, and hope you enjoyed it. Now we have Valerio raised his hand, but
no, it was a feller. Sorry.
A filler. Okay. Otherwise, if you have a question, no problem. All right.
Just I have a question.
Okay.
And you said when a clozapine patient, do you see some kind of erhöhte Anfallbereitschaft in English? I don't know how to say.
Yeah.
Okay. We don't we pay attention to not increase if not needed the doses of clozapine, but would you maybe go with a low potent anti-epileptic to flankieren, so like levetiracetam?
Yeah. So Keppra or something, you can do this. So you have to take together
without symptoms.
The clinical history, if you need to increase the dosage because the psychotic features are still there, then you can discuss whether to switch. But most of the time, if you need clozapine, you already tried everything else, so you need to increase that, and then you can combine it with an anti-epileptic drug, exactly. And on the other side, if you don't need to do it and you only have some ETPs, but you see that they are stable even after increasing the dosage, then you can stay. You say every 3 months you can do an EEG, and if it's like stable, you have the same amount of ETPs, then it's safe. But if you see they're increasing, then would I also suggest to include an anti-epileptic. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for joining, and I wish you a good start to the week, and hope to see you next time. Bye bye.